You're about to discover why the more spiritually awake you become, the more resistance you encounter. Why friends and family start ghosting you. Why your family accuses you of changing. Why your coworkers feel uneasy around you. And it's not because you're doing something wrong. It's because you're doing something profoundly right. Eckhart Tolle teaches us something that most spiritually awakened people discover the hard way. Your conscious presence, it triggers the egos of others. And this isn't just some abstract feel-good theory. It's documented neuroscientific, psychological, and social reality. But first, let's aggressively destroy a dangerous illusion. You've been conditioned to believe that spiritual growth makes you more accepted, more loved, more respected. And when the opposite happens, when you awaken and people pull away, you automatically assume you're doing something wrong, that you're not being compassionate enough, that you need to try harder to be understood. That's a trap, because the problem isn't you. It's that your awareness exposes their unconsciousness, and egos, well, they hate being exposed. Tolle explains it like this. When you live from the present, when you're no longer identified with your thoughts, when you don't react automatically to dramas, you become a mirror. And that mirror, it reflects back to unconscious people just how asleep they are. And nobody likes to see that. Now, let's energetic dive into the neuroscience behind all of this. Recent research on ego defense mechanisms shows that when the ego is threatened, the brain activates automatic responses. Projection, denial, rationalization. And these responses are mysterious, unconscious. The person doesn't even know they're reacting defensively. They genuinely believe you are the problem. So, what happens when you, spiritually awake, interact with someone deeply identified with their ego? Your calm presence threatens their pattern of drama. Your refusal to engage in gossip threatens their social identity. Your inner peace threatens their narrative that life is suffering. And their ego interprets this as an attack. So it counterattacks. It accuses you of being arrogant, cold, disconnected, changed, and all the while, you're just being present. This is what Tolle calls the collective unconsciousness reacting to consciousness. And it's inevitable. Because you can't wake up without making others realize they're asleep. And most people, they don't want to wake up. They prefer the familiar dream to the unknown awakening. There's a surprising study in transpersonal psychology that interviewed 13 people who experienced spiritual awakenings, and they all reported the same thing: increased social isolation, difficulty sharing their experiences, a sense that they no longer resonate with the people around them. And not because they've become antisocial, but because their frequency has changed. And here's the serious, crucial detail. Researchers discovered that 78% of spiritual awakenings happen spontaneously, often through trauma or crisis. And after the awakening, these people face an enormous challenge, living in a world where most operate from the ego, while they operate from the present. And that creates friction, constant friction, because superficial conversations no longer sustain you, pointless dramas no longer attract you, and people, they sense this. They feel that you're not playing the game, the social game, and that irritates them. Tolle says the ego lives on conflict. It needs enemies. It needs drama. It needs constant validation. And when you stop providing that, the other person's ego feels hungry, and it blames you for that hunger. So, let's get to the specific signs that your consciousness is irritating the egos around you. Sign 1. People start accusing you of thinking you're better than them. You didn't say that. You never claimed superiority. But your peace is interpreted as sarcastic arrogance. Because to someone deeply identified with anxious thoughts, your calm mind seems impossible.
So instead of asking how you achieved it, their ego decides you're faking it. That's classic projection. An ego defense mechanism identified by Freud and validated by modern neuroscience. The person projects their own insecurity onto you and believes that projection is real. Sign 2. People stop telling you their dramas. They stop inviting you to gossip. And when you notice this, you might think, great, less drama. But it also means they've sad excluded you from their social circle. Because gossip, it's social currency for egos. And if you don't participate, you're out. Tolle teaches that gossip is the ego's way of strengthening itself by criticizing others. It's a way to create a disgusted, false sense of superiority. And when you don't engage, their ego loses that resource, so it avoids you. Sign 3. Family members say you've changed, and they say it with a tone of accusation. You used to be so fun, so sociable, so normal, and now you're weird, different, distant. And the subtext is, go back to being who you were. Go back to validating our dramas. Go back to making us feel comfortable. But you can't go back, because awakening isn't reversible. Once you see, you can't unsee, and that creates a melancholic distance between you and the people who choose to remain asleep. Sign 4. You become the target of disgusted, passive-aggressive behaviors, indirect comments, judgmental looks, subtle exclusion from events, and you haven't done anything explicitly wrong, but your presence itself has become an inconvenience because it mirrors their unconsciousness. And this is documented in research about spiritual awakening. Individuals report that the more conscious they become, the more social resistance they face, because consciousness exposes unconscious patterns, and egos protect those patterns desperately. Sign 5. Conversations with you become aggressive. You make a simple observation, and the person responds as if you've attacked them, because your non-reactive presence highlights their reactivity, and that's uncomfortable. So they react defensively without even realizing it. Tolle explains, when you're present, you're not playing the ego's game, and that surprises people. They expect you to react, to defend yourself, to jump into the drama, and when you don't, their ego doesn't know what to do, so it attacks harder, trying to provoke a reaction. Now, there's something serious I need to clarify. This is not an excuse to be insensitive. It's not a license to treat people poorly and then blame their ego for the reaction. True consciousness comes with compassion, and compassion means understanding that people are suffering. They're trapped in patterns, and they don't even know they're trapped. So, when someone reacts defensively to your presence, you don't judge them, you don't feel superior, you just recognize this person is operating from their ego, and their ego is doing what egos do, defending itself from perceived threats. And you have a choice. You can walk away with peace, you can maintain a healthy distance, but you don't need to demonize that person because you've been there. You were pure ego once too, and something or someone helped you awaken, so you can have compassion for those still asleep. But compassion doesn't mean disgusting abuse. It doesn't mean staying in toxic environments. It doesn't mean sacrificing your peace to make others feel comfortable. Because if you do that, you slip back into unconsciousness, and nobody wins. Eckhart Tolle says you can't wake anyone up. People awaken when they are ready, and trying to force awakening is a form of spiritual ego, which is ego disguised as spirituality, and it's just as destructive as regular ego. So what do you do when you realize that your consciousness is irritating the egos around you? First, accept that this is calm. It's not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's a sign that you're growing, and growth always creates distance between you and those who choose to stagnate. Second, stop trying to explain your awakening. Tolle teaches that awakening is an ineffable experience. Words can't capture it. And when you try to explain it to someone deeply identified with their ego, they interpret it through the filter of their ego and completely angry it. So you save your energy. Stop justifying. Stop trying to make others understand and simply live confident your truth. Third, find a hopeful, conscious community. This doesn't mean abandoning everyone you know, but it means seeking out people who resonate with your frequency. Because total isolation isn't the solution. Humans are social beings. We need connection, but connection with those who see us, not with those who judge us. Maybe join a meditation group or a mindful book club. Fourth, use the resistance as feedback. When someone reacts defensively, it shows you where their ego is most active, and that's valuable information. Not for you to judge, but for you to understand how to navigate the interaction. If someone is sensitive about their status, you know to avoid conversations about success. If someone is sensitive about relationships, you know to avoid conversations about love. And this isn't manipulation, it's confident social wisdom. Tolle calls this conscious action in an unconscious world. But there's something even deeper about why your consciousness irritates egos that most awakened people don't understand. And understanding this completely changes how you navigate relationships. The ego is not your enemy. Tolle teaches this repeatedly, but it's often misunderstood. The ego is a psychological structure that helped you survive. When you were a child, you needed your parents' approval to survive, literally. So you developed an ego that constantly monitors, am I safe? Am I approved? Am I loved? And it worked. It kept you alive. But as you grow, that structure becomes a prison because you no longer need external approval to survive. But the ego doesn't know that. It continues operating as if your life depended on being accepted. So when you awaken and stop seeking approval, your own ego panics, and the egos of others do too, because they are mirrors. When your ego sees someone living without needing approval, it thinks, is that possible? And that thought is threatening because it questions the entire structure that the ego has built. Research in neuropsychoanalysis shows something surprising. What Freud called the id, the unconscious part of the psyche, knows more than the ego admits. The unconscious perceives truths that the ego denies. And when an unconscious person meets a conscious person, their unconscious recognizes something true. But the ego blocks that recognition and creates discomfort. So the person feels something strange around you. They can't name it, but it's real. And their ego interprets it as, this person is weird, arrogant, too different. When in reality, the discomfort comes from the fact that their presence recognized your presence, but their ego won't allow conscious recognition. And that's a tragedy, because at the deepest level, all people yearn for real connection, for being seen beyond the masks. But the ego is so afraid of being vulnerable that it blocks exactly what the soul most desires. Tolle calls this the pain body, an accumulation of old emotional pain that the ego keeps alive because it identifies with it. And when you, a conscious person, don't feed someone's pain body, that person feels strangely empty because they were accustomed to using you as fuel for their drama. And here's a practical example. Someone comes to you to complain about something. They expect you to validate their complaint, to agree that the situation is terrible, that the other person involved is awful. And in the past, you would have done that because you wanted to be a good friend. But now you're conscious, and you see that the complaint is just the ego seeking validation. So you listen with presence, but you don't feed the drama. Maybe you offer a different perspective, or just remain in gentle, compassionate silence. And what happens? The person feels unsatisfied. You didn't give their ego what it wanted, so they pull away and look for someone who will feed the drama. And you might feel bad, think you failed as a friend. But Tolle would say, confident, You didn't fail. You refused to participate in unconsciousness. And that's gentle, because feeding someone's drama doesn't help. It just keeps them trapped. So by not feeding it, you offer the hopeful possibility, even if the person doesn't recognize it immediately. Now, there's a serious, crucial difference between not feeding the drama and being cold. People confuse this. They think that consciousness means not caring. But true consciousness is the opposite. You gently care deeply, but you don't get lost in the drama. So when someone is suffering genuinely, not dramatically, you are present. You offer compassion. You help if you can. But when someone is creating suffering through repetitive thoughts, you don't validate those thoughts. You point them toward presence. And this can irritate them because they want you to agree that their thoughts are reality. And you gently suggest that they're just thoughts, and that threatens the entire structure they've built. There's another interesting phenomenon that happens when you awaken. People start confessing things to you, secrets, fears, vulnerabilities, and you wonder, surprised? Why me? Why are they telling me this? Tolle explains, your presence creates a safe space. Because you don't judge, you don't project, you just are. And people feel that, even if they don't consciously understand it. So they open up, because they've finally found someone who can hold their shadows without running away. And that's beautiful, but also challenging, because you become a repository for other people's pain. And if you don't have clear boundaries, you can feel overwhelmed. So you need to learn. I can be present for someone's pain without absorbing it. I can witness without carrying it. And that's practice. It doesn't happen automatically. You train, you breathe, you feel your body, you maintain your anchor in the present while the person shares. And then you let it go. You don't keep ruminating about what the person said. Don't try to mentally solve their problems. Just be present in the moment. And then the moment passes. But some people, after opening up to you, they become uncomfortable because they've shown vulnerability and their ego feels exposed. So they start avoiding you. Or worse, they attack you. Because your presence reminds them of what they revealed, and the ego wants to erase that. And you can't do anything about it. Just accept it and continue being present without taking it personally, because it's not about you. It never was. Now, let's talk about something that few people address: the tired, energetic cost of living consciously in an unconscious world, because there is a cost, and denying that creates unnecessary suffering. When you're in a highly unconscious environment, a stressful office, a disgusted family, a superficial social group, maintaining presence requires energy because you're swimming against the current. Everyone around you is operating on autopilot, and you're consciously choosing presence in every moment. And that's exhausting. It shouldn't be, but it is, because you still have a body, and your body responds to environments. So being surrounded by unconsciousness, even if you remain conscious, drains your energy. Eckhart Tolle recognizes this, and he suggests choose your environments wisely. You can't always control where you need to be, work, family obligations, but you can create hopeful spaces for regeneration, time alone, nature, silence, where you don't have to keep your guard up. Because maintaining conscious presence in an unconscious environment is like holding a muscle contracted. Eventually, you need to relax it, and if you don't create spaces to relax, you'll eventually collapse and temporarily revert to unconsciousness because your body demands rest. So self-care isn't a luxury, it's a necessity, and that's not selfishness, it's confidence. You can't be a constant light if you never recharge. And here's something that irritates egos deeply: you saying no, you setting boundaries, you prioritizing your rest over their demands, because egos interpret that as rejection, as if you don't care. But the truth is the opposite. You care enough to keep yourself healthy, to avoid burnout, to continue being a stable presence, and that serves everyone in the long run. But the ego only sees the short term. It only sees, you said no to me. And you can't educate the ego.
You can't explain, I said no because I need to take care of my energy. The ego doesn't understand. It only hears rejection. So you simply, confident, maintain the boundary and accept that the person might get upset. And that's okay. Tolle teaches your inner peace is more important than external peace. If you sacrifice your inner peace to maintain external peace, you lose both. Because external peace based on your sacrifice isn't real peace. It's a temporary truce. And lost inner peace creates resentment that eventually explodes. So you protect your inner peace, not violently, not aggressively, but firmly. And that's self-love. And self-love irritates egos that are used to using you. Now, there's one last insight that I need to share, and it's the most important. When you awaken, you don't become perfect, you become aware. And there's a huge difference. Perfection is an ideal of the ego. Awareness is the recognition of what is. So, you're still going to make mistakes. You're still going to have moments of unconsciousness. You're still going to react sometimes. And that's human. And when that happens, people's egos might latch on. See, you're not so conscious after all. You're a hypocrite. And part of you might agree. You might feel like an imposter. But Tolle would say that's the ego judging the ego. True awareness doesn't judge lapses, it just notices them, learns, and returns to presence. Without drama, without self-flagellation. Just, I went back to unconsciousness, and now I return to presence. And that gentleness with yourself is crucial, because if you judge yourself severely for not being perfectly conscious, you create more ego, a spiritual ego, which is even more rigid than the common ego. So you allow yourself to be human, imperfect, in process, and that's liberating, because you stop trying to prove that you're enlightened, and you just live the best way you can, moment to moment. And when people criticize you for not being perfectly conscious, you can smile inwardly, because you never claimed perfection. You're just trying to be present, and that's enough. The journey of awakening seriously never ends. There's no finish line where you become permanently enlightened and never face challenges again. Tolle, decades after his awakening, still teaches that each moment calls for presence. Each situation offers an opportunity to choose consciousness or unconsciousness. And the more you choose consciousness, the more natural it becomes. But there will always be moments that test you. There will always be egos that resist your presence, and that's part of the human experience. So, you don't fight it. You don't try to change reality. You just navigate it with wisdom, with compassion, with clear boundaries, and with a deep acceptance that you don't control other people's reactions. You only control your response. And your response, when it comes from presence, is always love. Even when love says no, even when love walks away, even when love chooses solitude over toxic company. Because true love honors truth, and truth sometimes requires separation. Fifth, maintain the practice of presence. Because when you face constant resistance, it's tempting to revert to old patterns, to pretend you haven't awakened, to perform the ego to be accepted. And many people do this. Tolle calls it a betrayal of the true self. And when you betray your true self to please egos, you suffer internally, because you know you're living a lie, and that lie corrodes your peace. So you choose authenticity with isolation or performance with false connections. And there's no universally right answer. Each person has to decide.
But spiritually awakened people, generally confident, choose authenticity because they've tasted false connections and they know they sad don't sustain. Now, let's talk about the phenomenon of the spiritual ego, because this is a serious trap that many awakened people fall into. The spiritual ego happens when you wake up, and then the ego aggressively hijacks the awakening. You start to identify as sarcastic, spiritually superior. You judge people who are sleeping. You feel special for having awakened, and that's just the ego in a new costume. Tolle seriously warns repeatedly, true awakening doesn't create a sense of superiority. It creates compassion. Because when you really awaken, you see that we are all consciousness.
And that egos are just conditioned patterns, not true identities. So when you encounter someone operating purely from the ego, you don't feel superior. You remember when you were there, and you feel compassion, and perhaps gratitude for having awakened. But if you feel superior, irritated, judgmental, you're still operating partially from the ego. And that's okay. Awakening isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing process. Eckhart Tolle himself says that even decades after his initial awakening, he still finds ego patterns emerging, and he simply observes them without judgment. So when someone gets under your skin for being asleep, pause, breathe, and ask yourself, is this compassion or judgment? If it's judgment, you still have work to do. And that's valuable information, not a reason to beat yourself up, just an invitation to deepen your presence. Now, there's something melancholic no one tells you about spiritual awakening. You don't just lose superficial connections. Sometimes you lose connections you thought were deep. Friendships of years, romantic relationships, even close family members. And it hurts because you don't want to lose these people. You love them, but you also can't go back to unconsciousness. And they either don't want to or can't awaken. So you end up on incompatible frequencies, and the connection dies naturally. Research in transpersonal psychology shows that this is one of the biggest challenges post-awakening: grief over relationships that don't survive the transformation. And it's real grief, because even if the person is still alive, the connection you had isn't. And here's what Eckhart Tolle teaches that helps. These people weren't your people. They were temporary companions suited to your level of consciousness at that moment. And as you evolve, your tribe changes, and that's natural. But the ego wants to hold on, wants to keep everyone, wants to be loved by everyone. And we suffer when we try to force connections that no longer serve us. So part of consciousness is consciousness, letting go. With gentle gratitude for what was, but without attachment to what isn't anymore. And when you let go, hopeful space is created, and in that space, new people enter. People who resonate with who you are now. And these connections are different, deeper, more real, because they're based on authenticity, not on masks. Now, let's talk about what to do when you're in social situations where your consciousness clearly irritates egos. Family gathered for Thanksgiving, a competitive work environment, a group of old high school friends. How do you navigate this? Eckhart Tolle teaches something happy. You don't need to announce your consciousness. You don't need to lecture people about presence. You don't need to correct other people's unconsciousness. You simply are, and your presence speaks louder than words. So, at a family dinner where everyone is tired, complaining, you don't need to say, "You're all too identified with negative thoughts." You just remain present, listen without absorbing, and when appropriate, offer a different perspective, gently, without imposition. And what happens? Sometimes nothing. People keep complaining, and that's okay. You're not there to save them, but sometimes someone notices, feels something different in you, and approaches you later, asks, "How do you stay so calm?" And then you have an opening to share, if you want to. But you never force it.
Because forcing is ego, and ego disguised as help is still ego. At work, you do your job well, maintain professional boundaries, don't engage in office politics, and some people will happily respect you for that. Others will anger you, and you can't control which. You can only control if you remain authentic and confident. With old friends, you might discover that you no longer have anything in common beyond history, and that's okay. You can maintain occasional contact, or you can gently drift apart gently. There's no rule, just awareness of what's confident for you.
And here's the happy paradox. The more you stop trying to be accepted, the more the hopeful, right people accept you. Because authenticity attracts authenticity and repels falseness. So you naturally filter for connections that serve you. Every video like this requires integrating neuroscience, transpersonal psychology, and the teachings of Eckhart Tolle of decades. The super thanks down below isn't just support. It's you saying, I value content that prepares me for the serious, real challenges of awakening, not rose-tinted fantasies. When you support this work, you choose truth over illusion and recognize that awakening is happy but serious challenging. Now, there's something serious about ego defense mechanisms that science has discovered. When the ego is confronted with evidence that contradicts its beliefs, it doesn't change its mind. It strengthens its original belief. This is called the backfire effect. Scientific American has seriously documented this. When you present facts to someone deeply identified with a belief, and those facts contradict the belief, the person doesn't accept the facts. They aggressively reject them more and believe even more in the original belief. Why? Because the belief isn't just an idea. It's part of the ego's identity. And the ego prefers to be right than to be well. It prefers to suffer in the familiar illusion than to grow through the uncomfortable truth. So, when you, spiritually awake, live in a way that contradicts someone's beliefs about how life should be, you don't inspire change. You inspire resistance. Because your existence is living evidence that their beliefs might be wrong. And the ego doesn't tolerate that. And this explains why spiritually awakened people often face more hostility from those who are half awake. People completely asleep don't even notice you. People fully awake recognize you. But people half awake with an active spiritual ego feel threatened because you represent what they claim to be but aren't truly. Eckhart Tolle observes this in spiritual communities.
Hierarchies based on who is more enlightened, competition over spiritual practices, judgment of who is truly conscious. All of this is ego, and it's especially insidious because it disguises itself as spirituality. So if you face resistance from spiritual communities, know this: you're not alone, and you're not wrong. You've simply exposed spiritual ego, and spiritual ego defends itself as fiercely as common ego. What to do? Eckhart Tolle suggests, observe, without judgment. Recognize, spiritual ego in action, and step away if necessary, but without creating a victim story, without feeding your own ego by saying, I'm more conscious than them. Just recognition, this doesn't serve me anymore, and movement forward. Now, let's get into what actually happens neurologically when unconscious people encounter your conscious presence. Neuroscience studies show that highly anxious or stressed people operate primarily from the limbic system, survival mode, fight or flight. And when they encounter someone operating from the prefrontal cortex, the mode of presence and conscious response, there's neural dissonance. Their brain registers, this person isn't reacting as they should. Something is wrong, and interprets this as a threat, so it activates defenses. Even if you haven't done anything threatening, your calm in itself is perceived as a dangerous anomaly.
And that's fascinating because it shows that the resistance you face isn't personal. It's neurological. Their brain literally can't process your presence without setting off alarm bells, because your presence doesn't fit the pattern they know. And that should free you from taking their reactions personally. When someone attacks you, judges you, avoids you, it's not about you. It's about their neural pathways, desperately trying to protect an outdated belief system. And you can't change that. Only they can, and only when they're ready. Eckhart Tolle teaches, accept that you cannot wake anyone up. You can only be, and your presence might plant a seed.
But germination is their choice and their timing, and trying to force it is serious violence. So, you live your truth, maintain your practice, and trust that whoever needs to awaken will awaken in their own good time. And you don't need to carry the responsibility for anyone's spiritual journey but your own. And here's the ultimate freedom. When you stop trying to make others awaken, when you stop worrying if they're annoyed by your consciousness, when you simply are, you find profound peace. Because you're no longer at war, not with their egos, not even with your own ego that desperately wants to be accepted. You just are, and that is confident. Comment now. Have you ever lost friendships or relationships because of your spiritual awakening? How did you handle it? Write it in the comments below. Because when you share your experience, you help others who are going through the same thing to feel less alone. And that's how a conscious community builds itself, sharing truth without judgment. And if you're facing resistance right now, remember, this too shall pass. Not because egos stop resisting, but because you stop needing their approval. And when you no longer need their approval, the resistance loses its power, and you become completely free.